Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Michelle Ronksley-Pavia, and welcome to the fourth webinar in the 2025 Griffith University Gifted Education Symposium series. We will soon be hearing from Professor Siegle on increasing motivation in students. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Yugambeh and Kombumerri peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands from which I'm speaking to you today. I recognise their continuing connection to the country, land and waters, and thank them for protecting this coastline, hinterland and its ecosystem since time immemorial. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. Please join me in acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and country from where you're joining us by posting in the chat. Also, let us know where in the world you're joining us from today. It's my pleasure, as usual, to thank once again the great organising team behind this year's Symposium webinar series, Mrs. Anna Fowler, who will be assisting with facilitating the Q&A session and reading your questions to our presenter, and Ms. Mary Ellen Feldhagen, who is our wonderful admin assistant. Please join me in thanking the organising team. So today's presentation will go for an hour, followed by about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. And please use the dedicated Q&A function rather than the chat for your Q&A questions, because they come up in a way that as facilitators we can actually monitor those and mark which ones have been responded to. So that would be the best way to put your questions in. You can use the chat to chat with each other in general, or to chat with us if you've got a particular question that you're having difficulty with, and then Anna will facilitate the Q&A session at about 8:40, and then we'll be saying our thank yous and goodbyes at about 5 to 9. So we're almost ready to introduce our presenter. I'd just like to provide an overview of the final webinar in the 2025 Gift Education Symposium series, which will be myself and Mrs. Catherine Clark presenting our recent research project, Pressing Issues in Australian Gifted Education, Findings from Multi-Stakeholder Perspectives. And that'll be coming up on Thursday, the 27th of November. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Siegle from the University of Connecticut, whose presentation is titled Increasing Motivation in Students. Professor Siegle is the Lynn and Ray Neag Endowed Chair for Talent Development at the University of Connecticut, where he directs the National Centre for Research on Gifted Education. He is past president of the NAGC and recipient of the 2021 Founders Memorial, 2018 Distinguished Scholar and 2011 Distinguished Services Award. He has been co-editor of the Journal of Advanced Academics and Gifted Child Quarterly. Dr. Siegle's research interests include web-based instruction, motivation of gifted students, and teacher bias in the identification of students for gifted programs. The experiences students have influence their beliefs and attitudes they hold toward themselves, given tasks and achievements itself. Therefore, what students believe determines whether they achieve. In this session, Dr. Siegle will share suggestions for increasing student motivation based on research over the past 20 years. He'll discuss the importance of offering students options in their learning, fostering confidence in their ability to achieve, and paying attention to student interests. When students value a task or outcome and have positive perceptions of their skills and their opportunities for success, they are more likely to implement self-regulatory behaviour and apply appropriate strategies for academic success. Dr. Siegle will discuss this in the context of 3 legs of talent development: opportunities for advanced content, inductive learning with depth and complexity, and authentic learning opportunities based on student interest to promote curiosity and risk-taking. Please join me in welcoming Professor Siegle. Thank you.
Thank you. Going to share my screen. Take me a second here. I think we're set. So thanks for getting up early this morning for this. Here in the US, our workday is just ending and your workday is just starting. So I'm excited to be joining you this morning. When we talk about student motivation and underachievement, I think a couple of questions come to mind initially. The first of those is that why might a student not be motivated? And in the work that we've been doing over the last 20, 25 years, we've sort of flipped that question a little. Instead of asking why might a student not be motivated, we've asked why might a student be motivated? And so our work is centered around more looking at what are the factors that cause students to be motivated. And that's how my wife, Betsy McCoach, and I developed what's known as the Achievement Orientation Model, which I'd like to just start by giving you a little background on that. So this model is based on the idea that the student has the capacity to be successful and just simply is not being successful for some reason. So we're not talking about students who might have a learning disability, a 2E individuals, for example, who there may be some reason for the achievement not being where it's expected. But in this model, the assumption is that the student has the skills necessary to be successful, is simply not being successful. And so we believe that there are three key beliefs that students have to have in order to be successful. The first of these is something called self-efficacy, and that's a term that Albert Bandura coined. And self-efficacy is this confidence about your ability to perform a task. It's not your confidence that you actually will succeed at the task, but it's a confidence about your ability that you can do it. And so before anyone would ever tackle a task, they have to believe that they have the skills to do it. And that's what self-efficacy is. So there are some kids that simply believe they're not good at mathematics, for example. And if this child believes she's not or he's not good at mathematics, then they're not going to put forth the kind of effort they need to be successful in mathematics. So the very first thing that has to happen, and we'll talk about ways to increase this, is there has to be this confidence that they have the ability. It's a little more nuanced than that because they not only have to have the confidence that they have the ability, but I'm going to also talk about how important it is why they have that confidence. But let's assume we have a child now that has the confidence to do it. The second factor that comes into play is something that we sometimes call goal valuation or meaningfulness. And the idea here is that in addition to being confident about a task, you have to think that this is a valuable task or you won't do it. So you might think you have the skills to do mathematics, but math isn't important to you. You're not interested in math, so why would you put any effort into it? And so that second factor also we find with achieving individuals, they have that. Not only they're confident about their abilities, but they're also very confident or they believe that the tasks they're doing are meaningful and there's a purpose to it. So you think, well, great, we're set. But there's a third factor that also plays into that, and it's something we call environmental perceptions. And that's the idea that you believe you're in a situation where you can be successful, that people aren't going to try to thwart your efforts or what you're doing. So in addition to having that confidence that you can do math and the confidence and the belief that math is important and you should do it, you also have to believe that you're in a situation where you can learn math. And sometimes we'll hear kids say, well, I can't learn from the teacher. I can't learn the way she teaches. I can't do it this way or that way. That's that third factor. They don't expect to be successful because their perception of the environment is that it's not supportive and it's not conducive to their success and their learning. What we find is that when individuals have these three things, when they have that confidence, when they think it's important, and when they feel like they're in a supported environment, they tend to engage and get the job done. And so they engage and they set realistic expectations, they implement appropriate strategies to be successful, and they use their executive functioning skills and they complete the tasks. So when we've worked with kids who are underachieving, one of the very first things we do is try to figure out, okay, what's the issue with this child? Is the issue that this child really isn't confident? Or is the issue this child just doesn't think this stuff is important? Or is the issue that the child doesn't feel supported? Okay, and so we'll talk about those and ways to address each of those. So the second question that we often talk about then is, well, what about being gifted might cause a student not to be motivated? So we've talked about the reasons why people are motivated. So are there things about being gifted that might contribute to those reasons? And Kate Snyder and her doctoral advisor, Lindenberg Garcia, came up with this idea that when they looked at underachievers, they saw two pathways for gifted kids to become underachievers. And the first pathway was this maladaptive competencies pathway. And in this, what happens is the kid's identity is tied to a gifted label, and that identity is also tied to the idea that learning is easy because they were able to learn at an early age quite easily. And so when learning becomes difficult, they self-handicap to protect their gifted identity. And I'll talk quite a bit about that one. There is a second pathway also according to them, and that is this declining values belief pathway. And in that case, it results because there was insufficient challenge in schoolwork right off when they came to school. And so they fail to see any value in schoolwork, and they don't connect effort with positive outcomes. And so they just don't think school is useful. So some kids have this gifted identity, and that's the thing that they value so much. And so sometimes it gets in the way of the achievement, and some kids just don't see school as useful. So when we look at motivation issues that might arise from being gifted, and based on our model and this model, we see there are kind of two areas we probably need to address. The first is we need to address this idea that identity becomes tied to achievement in the gifted label. That can be problematic sometimes for motivation. It can also be a benefit, by the way. And the second area to think about is this idea that gifted kids are experiencing this asynchrony with their peers. And that can be an issue that influences motivation both positively and negatively. And so within that first area, the identity becoming tied to achievement and the gifted label, I think there are kind of three areas we really need to talk about, and I'll be talking about this morning. And that is when giftedness is tied to their identity, there's this need sometimes for them to feel like they have to be perfect. We sometimes also see that they start developing a fear of failure. And the other thing we sometimes see is that they develop imposter phenomenon. And related to that, I think there's the importance of understanding giftedness, which is tied very much to this imposter phenomenon. With relationship to the experiencing asynchrony with their peers, the couple factors there that I'd like to talk with you this morning about are, this idea of with this asynchrony, sometimes there are these esoteric interests and these really passionate interests, and those can really be used to address achievement issues, but they also sometimes can hinder them. And secondly, we have the asynchrony of skills, which we obviously know about. Gifted kids have higher skills usually than other kids. And so as we continue here, I'd like to kind of address these 5 areas. So I'd like to start with this need to be perfect. And so while this session wasn't intended to be on perfectionism, I'm going to talk just a little bit about perfectionism, make sure we all sort of have the same background on that. So perfectionism researches, I've always been interested in it, and I think there are kind of 3 unresolved issues with respect to what we know about perfectionism and gifted kids. The first issue is, are gifted students more perfectionistic? And I can cite you some studies that have found that gifted students are more perfectionistic than other kids. And I can also cite some studies that don't indicate that gifted kids are any more perfectionistic than other kids. So basically, we don't know right now if gifted kids are more perfectionistic than other kids, but one of the things we do know is gifted kids, like other kids, suffer from perfectionism, and so it's an issue we need to be dealing with. The second unresolved issue about perfectionism is, can there be such a thing as a healthy perfectionist? I'm going to cough for a second, sorry. I happened to pick up a cold from my son, so I'm going to stick a cough drop in if that's all right. Sorry about that. And there are some people that think, yes, it is possible to be a healthy perfectionist. And they would often call that maybe a pursuer of excellence. And they say there's no problem. It's great, to try to achieve perfection. There are other researchers who say, oh, that's a deadly world. And, you are fooling yourself if you think that perfectionism is attainable or it's something that people should be pursuing, because eventually it's going to grab you and paralyze you, because you're going to realize you can't always be perfect, and it's going to set you up for all kinds of of failures. So whether there's such a thing as healthy perfectionism or not, we don't have agreement on that. And then the third factor is something that I've noticed in some of the work we've done is, in some cases, the issue actually isn't perfectionism, it's this need for control. So people who sometimes are perceived as perfectionists, it's not really about perfectionism at all. It's about these individuals just have this need to be in control of everything. And so when we're trying to address this problem of achievement, if we're working on the perfectionism, it sometimes doesn't work because it's not perfectionism that's the problem. It's a control issue, and we should be working on the control issue as opposed to the perfection issue. So those are kind of three unresolved issues with perfectionism. But basically, pretty much everyone agrees that there are kind of three types of perfectionists out there. And this work comes from Flett and Hewitt, and those three types are self-oriented, socially prescribed, and other-oriented. In the self-oriented, the individual puts the perfectionism on him or herself. It originates from within the individual. It's likely tied to personality, maybe. It maybe have come from parenting or the way school treated the kid. But this kid just has such high expectations for herself. So that's one kind of perfectionist. The second kind of perfectionist is the socially prescribed, who feels that other people are expecting them to be perfect. And so they're not striving for perfection, but they really believe there's all this pressure on them to be perfect. And sometimes they feel that being loved or accepted by others is contingent upon their achievement and them being perfect. And so that's another kind of perfectionism. And then the third kind of perfectionism is someone who's not necessarily a perfectionist themselves. They don't feel others are putting perfection on them, but they're expecting people around them to be perfect. And so they're putting high expectations on their teachers, on their friends, and that can be a problem with achievement also. And so when we think about perfectionists, it can be one of those three, and the way we deal with each of those is, slightly different. So, we wonder, why do children sometimes become perfectionists? Well, Miriam Adderholt Elliott wrote a book about 30, 40 years ago called What's Bad About Being Too Good, and she kind of set the standard for much of what we know about perfectionism, and there are lots of people since then, including a number of my doc students have written some books on it. We do know birth order is a factor. Firstborns tend to be more perfectionistic than others. We don't know what that is, but it's possibly. I mean, as a father, when our first kid was born and all of a sudden she can walk, I was so proud, and I couldn't help but show off how great she was walking every place we went. And so parents are really proud of their kids, what their kids are doing, and consequently, this kid starts to have to become a performer, and then therefore ultimately becomes a perfectionist. We know generational inheritance or modeling is a factor. Tends to be that if your parents were a perfectionist, you tend to be a perfectionist. We don't know if that's genetic or the modeling, but it just seems to be the way it is. Another thing we know is the super kid syndrome tends to encourage perfectionism, and that has to do with gifted ed in many ways. So you have this really bright kid, and we're trying to advance this kid, and so we're sending the kid to camp, and we're doing all this advanced work with the kid, and so we sometimes are setting up the kid for perfectionism that way. Messages from the media can also set up kids for perfectionism. If you buy this product, you're going to be better, you're going to be more liked, you're going to be prettier. That's what advertising is all about, is telling people that they can improve and be perfect if they buy the products. So the media sends that. Sometimes kids are just built that way, and so that can be a factor. Don't know why. And then lastly, sometimes kids who come from dysfunctional families can have high levels of perfection. Say that there's substance abuse with one of the parents, for example, and the kid thinks, well, if I'm perfect, if I don't mess up, maybe mom or dad won't be doing this, and consequently, that can be a factor. So there are a number of reasons why it happens, but we can do some things to help it. One of the first things we can actually do is we can support non-evaluative activities. So we can involve them in things that don't get evaluated. I used to jog when I was younger, and I loved jogging. And people would always say to me, Dell, you ought to go in this 5K race, or you ought to do this race. Or, Dell, we'd love to go jog with you. And I jogged always at night by myself just to unwind. And I knew that I had some perfectionism issues. And so if I ever went to a race, I would want to beat those other people. And so I realized that the second I started doing races, or the second I started jogging with other people, my perfectionism was going to come out. And, I was going to beat this person if I were running with somebody else, or I wasn't going to breathe as hard as they were. I'd hold my breath and pass out before I'd show that I was more tired than they were. So I learned very quickly that was my non-evaluative activity, just have fun jogging by myself. And so if you can have some activities for kids that don't get evaluated, that's great. Another thing is we can acknowledge and appreciate growth. And so when we're complimenting kids, we can talk about their growth and how much they've learned rather than putting it against some sort of standard. And so we're just acknowledging the growth rather than trying to make some comparison or make it evaluative. Obviously, we won't want to tie personal value to giftedness, because tying personal value to giftedness is a sure way to set people up for lots of problems. Tom Hebert, who recently retired, he did a lot with bibliotherapy and also with movie therapy, where you share stories with kids, books with kids about people who made mistakes. There are a lot of movies that address the issue of perfectionism, and those have been quite successful in helping perfectionists. Another thing that works with perfectionists is when they have a very large task and they're somewhat paralyzed. If we can break it into smaller tasks, and so they can experience these small successes with these smaller tasks, that can be very useful and can work quite well. We can teach kids debugging. If any of you have ever been a computer programmer or written computer programs, you know that the first time you run it, it doesn't always run perfectly. You don't throw the program away and start typing from scratch. What you do is you go through and you debug it. You look at and see how you can fix it, how you can make it fixable. And so that's a strategy we often use with perfectionism. They read a story and they don't like it and they just rip it up. I'm going to start over. No, let's debug this story. And so that debugging task has been really quite successful. And then as a teacher or as a parent, being a role model is also very helpful with a perfectionist who's underachieving because of that perfection. When we model that, hey, we make mistakes and it's okay, and I modeled it didn't come out exactly right, but I can work on it and fix it, and yeah, this is pretty good, I like it. That's also very helpful. So those are some strategies we can use to address perfectionism. There's this great quote by Henry Van Dyke that I love: use what talents you possess. The world would be very silent if no birds sang there except those that sang best. This happens to be a picture I took of a hummingbird in our yard, and I'm not even sure they even sing, but the sounds they make aren't that great, but they still make those sounds, So we should appreciate the talents we possess. The second area in this area of identity becoming tied to achievement in the gifted label is this idea of fear of failure. There's a great quote from James Joyce that is, mistakes are the portals of discovery. Isn't that just a beautiful statement? Mistakes are the portals of discovery. Another way you could think about that is mistakes are part of the wonderful adventure of learning and growing. Because when we make mistakes, that's when we really learn something. And, there are mistakes I've made, and I will never forget that lesson. And so we need to help kids understand that these mistakes are real opportunities to improve ourselves and get better. And we need to model that, and we need to be careful of modeling it. So I'm a father of 2 kids, and it didn't really occur to me for quite a while that those kids are watching me. I've been watching them, I'm raising them. And a few years ago, I had to have some back surgery, and it left me, so I couldn't walk for a while, and it was winter and I was at home, and I'm the guy that always starts the fire in the fireplace when we have a fire, and I'm sitting on the couch, and all of a sudden I notice there's a fire in the fireplace. And I said to my daughter, who started the fire? And she said, I did. And I said, how did you know how to do it? And she said, I've been watching you for years. They're watching us all the time. And so we are modeling things. So one of the things in our family is that we get lost a lot. And I often joke that the GPS saved our marriage because we just get lost a lot. And sometimes we think we're lost when we're not even lost. And so we're on these adventures all the time. And whenever we get lost, I would say to the kids, hey, isn't this a great adventure? And my daughter one day mentioned that she had mentioned that to her teacher. And her teacher said, well, that's a great philosophy. She said, I said to the teacher, mistakes are simply adventures. And I think that's a really good way to talk to your kids. When you make these mistakes, this is an adventure we're going on. And let's see what we can make out of that adventure. And so we need to model those things with kids in addition to telling them to them. Taylor Swift, who was the Person of the Year a couple of years ago for Time, she's pretty much got it all. She's got the boyfriend, she's got the money, she's got the career, she's got the voice. And someone was talking to her about fear of losing it, and she said, I kind of start living by the motto, I'd rather enjoy than spending every single minute being afraid of losing it. And I thought, that's a great attitude. I'm going to enjoy this instead of worrying about losing it. And so this fear of failure, oh my God, I did well on this test, but am I going to do well on the next one? Enjoy the moment, and we'll worry about the other stuff later. So with respect to strategies to address fear of failure, the big one for me is that we need to help kids see mistakes as unplanned adventures. And they are adventures that they can learn from. As teachers, we need to minimize consequences of plans gone awry also. And so when kids try new things, if they don't work well, the penalty can't be that great. When I started college, I took an expository writing class, and I was just getting perfects on all my essays. And so I didn't feel like I was growing as a writer. They'd give you the assignment for the week, I'd write it, I'd get a great grade. And so I started experimenting with my writing style. And I got slightly lower grades. And the professor came up to me and said, what are you doing? And I says, I'm trying to experiment with my writing. And she said, go back to the way you were writing. It's fine, But she didn't give me this chance to grow as a writer, really. One of my favorite things in one of my math classes when I was in college is the professor gave 4 tests, and he took your grade for the top 3. And so if you missed the test, well, you didn't get to retake it, you missed it, that would be one of them. But he did the same thing with homework. We would have like 15 homeworks, and your top 10. It really took the pressure off, and you didn't have to worry so much about failing because you had those options. I've already talked about that we see mistakes as fixable and learning opportunities. So not only are they unplanned adventures, but they're fixable. And something my wife is pretty good at is playing out the worst case scenario. So when a kid has this fear of failure, oh my God, I'm not going to do well on this test, and it's the end of the world, Well, it's not the end of the world. And so Betsy's been able to talk about, well, what's the worst could happen? And when you have that conversation in a kind of a calm way with a kid, they're going to realize that the worst that could happen isn't that bad, actually. Oh, so my grade's going to drop a little bit, but I can make it up later. Or, oh, this person, this girl's going to break up with me. Well, that's kind of a tough one to go with, but what's the worst that's going to happen? Oh, you're going to meet this really nice person and, fall in love and have 15 kids. Who knows? But the idea is if you can play out the worst case scenario, they'll understand it isn't as bad as anybody ever imagined. With respect to the identity becoming tied to achievement and the gifted label, another area that can be an issue is imposter phenomenon. And in talking about imposter phenomenon, I also want to talk about understanding their own giftedness. So I had a kid that was identified for gifted services in 4th grade, and I had him for 4th, 5th, 6th grade. And one day he was having a shaky day in 6th grade, and he said to me, my parents paid for me to be in the gifted program. And I cockingly said, I wish they had, but they hadn't, obviously. But he truly believed that his parents had paid the school to put him in the gifted program and that he never belonged there. And so for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, he was sitting the entire time thinking he was an imposter. And that had to be just a horrible experience. And so I spent a lot of time talking with him about that and trying to figure out where this came from. And as he's talking, he started crying, and he said, in 1st grade, I drew a picture and my teacher didn't like it. And she said she liked it, but she really didn't like it. And I thought, wow, his teacher, he draws this picture. The teacher looked at it, probably thought, ooh, this is a piece of crap. But oh, she said, oh, this is a really nice picture. And he sensed her insincerity. And he internalized at that point, don't trust people who give you compliments. And so we really, one of the things we need to be really careful about is the sincerity with which we give kids feedback. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. We had another case where in our school, we tend to identify kids in 4th grade, but we every year would add additional kids if there were data to suggest that they would benefit from the gifted program. And so we brought this kid in 7th grade, and he was not doing that well, to be honest. And so he was probably the lowest scoring of the group, and things were kind of rocky as it was starting there. And when I started at this school, the 8th grade teacher told me that, it's really tough on kids on their birthdays because, when they're in elementary school in the US, they used to bring cupcakes and things, little treats on their birthday. But when you're in middle school or junior high, it's not cool to show up with cupcakes on your birthday. So you kind of want people to know it's your birthday, but at the same time, it's kind of embarrassing. And how do you tell them? So she said in 8th grade, she made a point of always bringing a little treat for the class on kids' birthdays. So I said, well, I'll do that with my 7th graders. And so this kid happened to have the first birthday in September. And I was a bachelor at the time, and about the only thing I could cook was Rice Krispie bars. And when I make Rice Krispie bars, I use like an entire bag of marshmallows and like 2 cups of marshmallows, 2 cups of Rice Krispies. So I like them really sticky and sugary, all right? So I made some Rice Krispie bars for my class, and I went and I bought a card. And at the time, I was like a $4 card, which now wouldn't be a very expensive card, but back then, that's kind of an expensive card. Excuse me. So class started. He was the first birthday. Nobody knew I was going to be bringing Rice Krispie bars for birthdays. And I have permission to use his name. I said, today is the birthday of somebody who's very important. And I see this kid in the back of the room, and I'm looking at him out of the corner of my eye, and he's thinking, I wonder who was born on my birthday. And I said, today is Mark's birthday. And he just lit up. And I said to him, so I made Rice Krispie bars for all of you, and I brought a card for you, Mark. And so he came up, and I gave him the card. And the first thing that kid did was turn over the card and look at the price on the back before he opened the card. And he went, $4. He was impressed I bought an expensive card. That kid went from being the worst student in the class to the best student in the class. And it all happened because he believed this guy believes in me, and this guy recognizes that I'm here and thinks I'm important. And so, that's the best $4 card I bought, and the best bag of marshmallows and Rice Krispies, because he went on to do great things. And that kid found out when my birthday was, and on my birthday, he brought Rice Krispie bars to the class. And for 20 years, that kid sent me Rice Krispie bars every year on my birthday, and I sent them to him on his birthday. And here's a picture of him as an adult, and these are my 2 kids, and he ended up being the godparent for my children. And so it's just amazing the relationships you can develop with kids if you pay some attention to them and appreciate them. And here are my two kids when they were little visiting Uncle Mark. And so you just never know the little things that make a difference on kids. So this whole thing about giftedness and we have this fine line that we have to walk, because in gifted education, we have a difficult balancing act between recognizing effort and ability. And what I mean is, in the United States, kids tend to believe that if you need to work hard, it means you're not smart. When in fact, we know that working hard makes you smart. And in Eastern culture, they get that. In the Western culture, they don't get that as well. I don't know how it works in Australia, but US kids believe that if you have to work hard, you're not smart, when in fact, it's the working hard that makes you smarter. One of the very first studies I ever published, it was with Sally Reese when I was a doc student. And we surveyed about 5,000 middle school kids, and we asked those kids about the quality of work they did. We asked them about their ability. We asked them how interested they were in things. And we asked them about their effort that they put forth. And then we ran correlations. And we also asked their teachers these questions. And when we looked at the relationship that teachers reported between the quality of work a kid produced and the ability that kid had, the correlation was 0.8 something. And when we square that, we get 66% shared variance, which you don't need to know, but there's a strong relationship. So teachers report a strong relationship between the quality of work kids do and their ability. Teachers also report a very strong relationship between the quality of work kids do and the effort that they use, which makes sense, and I believe that. When we ask the kids, what's the quality of work you do? What's your effort like? We also saw a very strong relationship. There's a strong relationship between the quality of work kids say they do and their ability. But when we looked at the relationship between the quality of work and how much effort kids said they put forth, we got a really small relationship. So unfortunately, we should have done some qualitative follow-up on this study. We don't know. Are these kids saying that they do quality work because of their ability and effort has nothing to do with doing quality work, which is a very bad thing? Or are they saying that they don't have to work hard to do quality work because they're not being challenged? That's a very bad thing also. But what we know is that kids do not see a relationship between effort and quality of work. And so we have this catch-22 now, because we have to help kids recognize that they have the ability to do well. That's the self-efficacy piece of the model. You got to have that confidence, or you're not going to try things. So we do have to help them recognize ability, but we also have to help them understand that they have some control in that ability, and that ability comes from effort. And that's where Carol Dweck's work really becomes quite important. And, you know, Carol Dweck's work's been around a long time. There's some controversy about it. There's some controversy about how much you can actually change these learning orientations. But Carol Dweck, she used to talk about performance goals and learning mastery goals before she talked about fixed and growth mindsets. And so performance goals are when people do things, they do them because they have to show how good they are at them. And people who have a performance goal orientation, they're going to show how good they are. People who have a learning or mastery goal orientation, they're going to go into situations to see how much better they can be, and they're less worried about how they perform. It happens that people who have the performance goal orientation also tend to believe that abilities are fixed, and they have this entity belief of intelligence. So that's where the fixed mindset comes. It's tied to this performance goal orientation. People with a learning mastery goal have this incremental view of intelligence, and they also have a growth mindset. So they see that abilities are malleable and can change. So here at the University of Connecticut, we're known for basketball. We call ourselves the basketball capital of the world. We have had like 11 national championships with our women, and we had a couple consecutive ones with our men recently. So we're pretty cocky about our basketball here. There are summer basketball camps. Your kid comes to the summer basketball camp, and if your kid's there, and I'm going to show these coaches how good I am. That's a performance orientation. Some kids come to this basketball camp and they say, wow, here's my chance to learn some things from Gino Oriyama. Wow, I'm going to learn some stuff here. And they don't worry about looking silly. They're in there to pick up the new skills. That's the learning. Now, it's not as clear cut as that, but those orientations exist. So what does that have to do with gifted education? Well, if you're a little kid and you've been told you're gifted, and school's been easy, by the way, and you like being gifted, you like the label, and you believe it's something that happened to you and you had nothing to do with it, and you bebop and you're in first, second, third grade, and then around fourth grade, things start to get hard and you're not sure whether you can do it or not. Okay, you like the gifted label. If you have a performance orientation and if you have a fixed mindset, when something tough comes up, and if you don't do well at it, what does that mean? Well, little kids with a fixed mindset think they're not gifted anymore. Because if I were gifted, I can do everything, you know? And so for little kids, for children who are identified as gifted, who have this fixed mindset, every challenging task is a test of their giftedness. And that is a horrible way to have to live. They're putting their giftedness on the line every single time there's a difficult task. And so what happens then is they have to find some way to hold on to that giftedness and not lose it. And so what they do is they will procrastinate and wait till the last minute to do projects, because if you wait till the last minute and it doesn't meet quite the gifted standard, that's okay, because, hey, you rushed. This wasn't your best work. You just did it last night. You waited till the last minute. For some of them, they won't even do it. They'll say, oh, I don't care about it. That's not important to me. They will take an F. They will take a 0 before they will take a lower grade on something that they worked on. Because by saying, oh, I didn't do it, that's not important to me, I'm still gifted. You didn't find out that I couldn't do it well. And so having this fixed mindset and being identified gifted is just a real bad combination. So that's why we have to work very hard with kids to change that fixed mindset to a malleable one. We have to help them understand that their giftedness is something that they developed. Now, they might have been lucky enough, excuse me, they might have been lucky enough to gotten a brain that can handle way more pieces of information. They might have a brain that learns much more quickly. So there are factors there, but they developed it and they learned to do stuff. And so we want to bring that to our attention, their attention. I apologize if you've heard me tell this story, but when I was a teacher, the librarian was telling me a story about how when she was in third grade, she had drawn a picture of a horse drawing. This is not the picture, by the way. This is a picture I've drawn of a horse drawing. This is a picture I've drawn of a horse running, but some people think it looks like a dog, but trust me, this is a horse running. So she said she drew this picture of a horse running and she showed it to somebody and he said, wow, that's the best picture of a horse running I've ever seen. And she told me she quit drawing for 3 years. And I said, why did you quit drawing for 3 years? And she said, I didn't know what I did right about it. And I was afraid the next picture wouldn't have it. So there are a couple lessons from this story. The first is something that Sylvia Rim talks about. And Sylvia says that we should never use est words. Est words are like best, brightest, fastest, prettiest, smartest, because est words have nowhere to go but down. So when you use an est word, that stops any future growth in a person's mind. And so you're getting faster is better than you are fastest, because we want people to understand there's always room for growth, and growth is what it's about. So Sylvia says, get rid of those est words. So the person shouldn't have said, that's the best picture of a horse I've ever seen. showed us that that's a great picture of a horse. Or, wow, you're doing good at drawing. But there's another trick to this. And that is that when we compliment kids, in addition to avoiding the S words, we need to recognize specific things they've done well and make it developmental. For example, what the librarian said to me is, I didn't know what I did right about the picture, and I was afraid the next one wouldn't have it. Okay, so that's a general compliment. I've done some research, and I did this as part of my dissertation, actually, and we find that people's confidence builds better if we give specific compliments versus general compliments. Those general compliments, hey, that was a great picture. I don't know what I did well. And so how can I do it the next time? Where if the person had said, wow, look how you made the mane, which I forgot to put a mane on this horse. Look how you made the mane of the horse look like it was flying in the wind. Yeah, I really am good at making manes fly in the wind. That specific compliment gives somebody something to evaluate, and it builds up their self-efficacy, and it doesn't paralyze them as much. And so they know, hey, I could do that again, okay? So we did a study where we gave specific versus general compliments, and we found that kids were more likely to be confident and achieve more when they got specific compliments versus general compliments. They were much more confident because it helps them recognize what they're doing well. But initially, that work didn't affect achievement. And so then we had to do a tweak before we got the achievement. And that is, in addition to complimenting specifically, the compliment needs to be developmental. And what I mean by that is, instead of saying, you're good at drawing the mane of the horse flowing in the wind, you've really learned how to draw a mane flowing in the wind. Because you've really learned puts you in a growth mindset instead of you're really good at, which puts you in a fixed mindset. And so we need to build this confidence by recognizing growth as well as recognizing it. So we recognize growth and the accomplishment, but we do that by using specific developmental compliments. And developmental meaning you've learned how to do this, you've gotten better at it. We want growth. So we want those growth compliments, but they should also be specific. And those are some really significant ways that you can increase kids' confidence about their ability to do stuff. So a tip for appreciating themselves and their talents and building their self-confidence is we need, first of all, to be sincere with compliments. Or we wouldn't say, wow, you've really worked hard and you're doing a great job when they didn't work hard, you know? And so we got to be careful because they'll say, yeah, well, I didn't really work hard. You know, she's just trying to compliment me. So they do need to be sincere. We need to help kids appreciate their growth within as opposed to comparing themselves across other people. Because when we recognize our growth within, we can feel really good. But if we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people, you're always going to find somebody who can do something better than you, unless you've got the gold medal, I guess, in the Olympics. But we want people to recognize their own growth and that they have something to do with it. Another thing that I think is really important on appreciating self is appreciating our own uniqueness. They need to understand that they're a unique, a once-in-all history event. I'm doing this workshop right now from what used to be Joe Renzulli's office. So I took over as chair of the Renzulli Center when Renzulli retired. That's a very intimidating thing to do, by the way. I am not anything like Joe Renzulli. I have not come up with half the great ideas that Joe Renzulli has had, you know. But, you know, I'm a pretty darn good Del Siegle. And so once I realized that I don't have to be Joe Renzulli sitting in this office, I can be Del Siegle and I can have a pretty good time. And so kids have to understand that also, that they're a unique once-in-all history event and nobody is better at being them than they are. And that it's really a waste of our time to try to be somebody else because we're the best us that we can be. And, you know, sometimes you have to be 70, 80 years old before you figure out it. But we got to help kids understand that they are this unique once-in-all history event and that it's their duty to figure out who they are and be that person. And lastly, We build that confidence by documenting growth to increase self-efficacy. So when we chart kids' progress, that's one way that we can document growth and increase their self-efficacy. So we've sort of talked about this identity becoming tied to achievement and gifted label. The gifted label isn't deadly by itself, but the gifted label tied to a fixed mindset can have problems for some kids. And so we need to have them understand that giftedness is about them developing their God-given talents. And it's about their growth and their control of that growth. And that growth is going to involve making mistakes sometimes and not getting it perfect sometimes, but that's okay because those are opportunities for them to even grow more and to avoid that imposter syndrome that they are who they are and they're the best person they are. So now we move over to the asynchrony piece of this and the experience of asynchrony and esoteric and passionate interests. So esoteric interests kind of fall into three sets. Sometimes this is an interest in a topic earlier than their peers. So they said, you know, all kids are interested in dinosaurs, they tend to be, but maybe the gifted kid's interested in dinosaurs at an earlier age. And so that's something you can play with and work with to help keep them motivated, okay? Sometimes the interest is an unusual topic that nobody else is interested in, okay? Sometimes that can cause a problem for them because other kids think they're weird because they're interested in this. And also, sometimes the interest is all-consuming. And you can use that to your benefit, but it can also be a problem with achievement sometimes when you can't get them off that to work on some other things. So these interests are an important piece of addressing motivation. I had this kid, Danny, who was leagues above anybody else in the gifted program for his year. And he's just a brilliant little guy. And one day I'm out doing playground duty out on the playground, and I'm talking to Danny, and I said, yeah, you know, he's in our gifted program, but it's just two of us out there. And I says, you know, Danny, you're really smart. And Danny said, really? I thought I was dumb. And I said, Danny, what would make you ever think that you were dumb? And he says, because I share this stuff with kids and they all say to me, that's dumb. Well, yeah, Danny, that's dumb because they don't understand it. Now, you'd think a kid that bright would figure out that when someone says that's dumb, they mean, I don't understand what you're saying. But he interpreted it as, no, they think I'm dumb. And they think that studying this is dumb. No, they're just saying they don't get it. And so having those unique interests, sometimes we need to talk with them about their interests a little bit more. And we should never underestimate the power of student interests in making learning meaningful. Interest is directly related to high achievement. Excuse me. We did a study a couple of years ago. Well, actually, now it's actually been 14 years ago that we published this. And it was when we were first looking at the Dweck work. And we took these honors students here at the University of Connecticut. So these are college freshmen. We asked them to reflect back on how skilled they were at a wide variety of things, at music, art, math, athletics, writing, spelling, dance, anything we could think of. We said, how talented are you at that? And at the time we were studying the Dweck stuff, so we asked them how much ability played into doing well, how much effort played into it. And just on a lark, we threw in a question, how interested are you in the topic? And when we run the correlations, the orange are areas where we see a significant correlation between things. And there's one column here that you can see is all orange, and that's interest. There was always a positive relationship between interest and how well kids said they did stuff. Now, we know with correlation that it doesn't mean causality. So we don't know, are kids interested because they do well? Do they do well because they're interested? But really, frankly, it doesn't matter. There's a connection between interest and doing well. And so we have to pay attention to students' interests, particularly if you have a kid underachieving. We've got to find out what this kid is interested in and find ways to tie that interest to the schoolwork. Another factor that's very tied to interest is choice. You know, our children are growing up in a world built around choice. I don't know if you figured that out yet, but you know, here in the US, we have a place called Blaze Pizza, and you go in there and they got every conceivable thing you'd want on a pizza, and you walk down the line and you tell them what they want, and they throw it in this hot oven, and 5 minutes or 3 minutes later, you got this pizza just how you want it. You go over to Subway and they make that sandwich just how you want it. This cheese, that meat, pickles, no pickles, onions. You go to the ice cream place. There are 1,000 different flavors. You go to your TV. You can watch pretty much anything, anytime. Our kids are growing up in a world built around choice. And having choice contributes to a sense of control and ownership. And that's one thing that we need for motivation is kids are more motivated when they have a sense of control and ownership. Unfortunately, choice is absent or limited during most of the school day for many students. And so we have to build some choice into students' days if we really want them to be motivated. And that choice can include studying things that interest them. I'm here at the University of Connecticut, and we're known for the school-wide enrichment model. This session is not meant to promote the school-wide enrichment model, but within the school-wide enrichment model, one of the things we have that are very popular are enrichment clusters, and those are opportunities where kids have an opportunity. Kids can go study things together on topics that they like. And there's a point, like for 3 Fridays, maybe for an hour and a half, you set up these different topics and teachers run them or parents run them, and they're mixed grade and they're really good. So you can look up enrichment clusters if you're interested, but it's a great way to build some choice into the day. And we find that on enrichment cluster days, attendance is way up. Kids want to be there. They want to be at school. Another factor is the type 3 projects that kids do in the school-wide enrichment model. And I just like to share, yeah, we got time. I'd like to share this story about a student project that really made a difference. So a book came out when I was teaching, and this is a long time ago, called A Day in the Life of America. And what they did is they asked photographers all over the US on a given day to take pictures of things that happened that day. And then the publisher compiled all these pictures and created a book and said, this is what America looked like on this day. Later, a book came out called A Day in the Life of the World, actually. But on this day, and there were pictures from the sun rising to the sun setting, okay? I shared this with my class. And one of the students said, wow, that's really cool. I'd like to do a photography project, A Day in the Life of my little brother. Now, this kid and his sister were in our gifted program, and the family had a child a little bit later, and the birth did not go well, and it didn't look like the baby was going to survive, and they had to helicopter it to a really high-tech hospital. The baby did survive, but the family was told there were going to be all kinds of issues with this baby. So we're all kind of feeling sorry for this family because they've got all these issues with this new baby. And here's this older brother who says, I'd like to do a photo essay on a day in the life of my little brother. And so I said, okay. And so this is back when we used film. I gave him a roll of film. He went in, he took some pictures. I taught him how to use the darkroom, which was kind of disaster. Sometimes he'd keep the box of photo paper open when you turn on the light. The bad news is it fogs it. The good news, it only fogs the first couple of sheets. The bad news, it fogs the edge of all the sheets. The good news, having pictures with black edges was kind of cool. Anyway, he finally manages to crank out 12 pictures in the day of the life of his little brother. Because these pictures showed doing exercise, playing peekaboo, all kinds of things. So one of the things we know about the type 3s in Renzulli is you do authentic products for authentic audiences. So we started talking and saying, okay, what do photographers do with their pictures? Now you've got these pictures, what do you do with them? And I tried to get him back in the darkroom to reprint some of these pictures because some were dark, some were light. He did not want to go back in there. He was done with his project. So we talk and we think, what do photographers do? And I said, oh, they have photo exhibits. And now, of course, you could do a book. Back then, you couldn't do a book. These are not pictures he took, by the way. Sorry, I didn't keep copies of them. I wish I had. So let's do a photo exhibit about the day in the life of your little brother. And so I talked to the parents, and that was okay with them. And because now we have a real product, a photo exhibit, and we want a real audience. So we talked to his Aunt Leslie, who worked at the bank. And she said, yeah, you can put your photo exhibit up at the bank. Suddenly this kid wanted to go back into the darkroom and reprint the pictures. And I said, what? And he said, some are too dark and some are too light. I want to do them over. I could not get him back in that darkroom a week before. But now he has a real audience that are going to see them. And so he is now more vested in it. And so he reprinted those pictures. We had the photo exhibit, and those pictures changed an entire community's attitude about what was going on in that home, because those pictures showed such love for this baby. And you did not feel sorry for this family at all. You rejoiced in this new child that was in their home. And so a little sixth grader can change an entire community's perceptions by doing a project. And what makes the difference, if you're unhappy with the projects your kids are doing, are they creating authentic products, and do you have an authentic audience? Your kids can write a story, and if it goes on the refrigerator, you're going to get one quality. If you take those stories and bind them into a book, you're going to get a better quality. If you take that book now and talk to the town librarian and say, hey, we got this book of children's stories written by third graders, would you put it in the library for people to check out? And they'll say, yes, that's kind of cool to have this book by third graders. They'll want to redo their stories because they want them even better. So if you really want top achievement, you got to have authentic products for authentic audiences. Well, a couple of years ago, this kid found me. He's now an adult, and he sent me an email. And he said, my wife and I bring up STEP as we raise our two boys. STEP was the name of our gifted program. Thank you for exposing us to some invaluable experiences at such a young age. I still can't believe I was set free in a darkroom in elementary school. And I love that phrase, set free in a darkroom. You know, he was set free in a darkroom, all right. It was pretty expensive for photo paper, but the idea that we can set kids free really kind of touches my heart. And that's what we need to be doing, is providing these opportunities that set kids free to learn and explore their passions. So when we see students' interest to increase motivation, we support using student interest to increase motivation. It's important that we support students' interests. We provide opportunities for students to incorporate their interests into assignments. We need to accept that interests change. So they may be totally invested in something and then they get a different interest. That's okay. And if kids don't have interests, we need to provide opportunities to expose students to different topics, because that's also really important. And so interest is a big key to addressing motivation. And if you're not paying attention to student interests, you're really missing the boat. So our last piece here, and the last piece related to asynchrony as well, is this asynchrony of skills. And the asynchrony of skills with gifted kids, there's an asynchrony with their peers often, because the gifted kids are much more advanced. But there's also an asynchrony across their own talents. There's an asynchrony within them across the various talents that they have. They're good at some things and not so good at other things. Here in the US, a typical... Excuse me. Here in the US, a typical fifth grade classroom has, like a 6th to 7th grade range. In a typical fifth grade classroom, only about a fourth of the kids are actually reading and are on math in fifth grade. Another third are a grade lower, and another third grade lower. But there are also 10% of the kids who tend to be above fifth grade, above that grade. And so, when we give teachers opportunities to differentiate, they always worry about differentiating down. But you still have that top group that also needs something. And so we have we have to provide opportunities for kids to have access to advanced content, especially these kids, because if they don't, things are going to happen in that second pathway that Kate Snyder found about not being challenged right off can lead to underachievement. And so basically there are 3 options, I think, to get that advanced content. You can do curriculum compacting. That happens right within the classroom. You can do some subject-specific acceleration, move them up to the next grade just for math, or you can do whole grade acceleration. And, Miriam Gross was really the champion for acceleration, your Australian legend. So one of the ways I explain it to teachers sometimes is let's just imagine for you all, you're here doing this, and let's pretend you're off at school, and you get home from school tonight, and the house is just a total mess. Your spouse has had a super party, there are kids everywhere, and so you spend hours cleaning. You got to have your spouse do it, but you spend hours cleaning, and you vacuum, and you get the house all vacuumed, and it looks great. And your spouse says to you, dear, why don't you re-clean the house and why don't you vacuum again? Now, you would think your spouse was crazy. And you say, I don't need to vacuum again. The house is clean. And then your spouse says, well, I'm afraid you'll forget how to vacuum. And you say, I'm not going to forget how to vacuum. And then so your spouse talks to her buddy or his buddy and says, I just don't understand. I know they know how to vacuum, but they just won't do it. I know she knows how to vacuum, but she just won't do it. Or I know he knows how to vacuum, but she won't do it. Well, this sounds pretty ridiculous. But we've often heard, or we've often said to someone, I'm afraid this kid's going to forget how to do these multiplication tables, so that's why we need to keep practicing them. I'm afraid you're going to forget how to vacuum. No, they're not going to forget how to do it, just like you're not going to forget how to vacuum. And we've also said or heard people say, I just don't understand it. I know this kid knows how to do this math, but they just won't do the worksheet. Well, they know how to do it. Maybe they're thinking they don't need to re-vacuum again. And so this is just one way to kind of think about it. So I've often thought, what's the most underused strategy in gifted education? And I've come to the conclusion, it's pre-assessment, figuring out what kids already know. Because when we pre-assess, then we can do things like curriculum compacting. So when we start a new math unit, we pre-assess and we determine what they know. We've proved it through the pre-assessment, and then we change it and give them something different. So that works really well to get the advanced math. But there are some kids that you would need to compact everything for the whole year. So in that case, they need subject-specific acceleration. And we are just concluding a study here on acceleration here in the US at the National Center. And we're recommending that kids be considered for subject-specific acceleration if they're in the top 10% locally on reading or math achievement. Those kids seem to be pretty good candidates for subject-specific acceleration. We're not whole grade accelerating them, but we are subject-specific accelerating them. And some kids, though, they don't just need acceleration in math. They need it in reading. They need it in science. So they're candidates for whole grade acceleration. And the kids that we've been recommending to be considered, not necessarily accelerated, because you got to look at the whole kid, but one of the things that we've been looking at as a screener for whole grade acceleration, and we've done it universally, is that we're considering kids who have a cognitive score of at least 120 and who are 2 grade levels above in both reading and math. So that's a second grader who has average reading and math achievement at 4th grade. That's 2 grade levels above. And that's a second grader, if we were doing second grade, who has a cognitive score of 120. So why this? The 120, so we know there's the brain power. That's about all you can have higher IQs, that's great. But kids who have at least a 120, they have the cognitive power to maintain doing really well. Because the last thing we would want to do is whole grade and accelerate a kid and then have them become a mediocre student. So we want their achievement to be average achievement, 2 grade levels ahead, a whole year before they go into that. So they're going to be just fine when they get there, and they've got a cognitive score that says their rapid rate of learning is going to continue. So those kids are really good candidates for whole grade acceleration if you're interested in doing that. The important thing about acceleration isn't about doing things faster. People always think that. It's about matching instruction to students' learning needs. And when we think about that, that's a good way to look at it. And I see my time is up. I'd like to, okay, if I just finish with a story about my wife here.
Please do.
Okay, so my wife, I met her and I had finished my PhD at UConn and she was looking at doing a PhD. And so I introduced her to Sally Reese and she decided to come to the University of Connecticut. And before she came to the University of Connecticut, we were talking, and I discovered that, by God, she'd taken all these semesters of statistics for fun. She'd read all these books. And so this program, I was worried, wasn't going to be academically challenging for her. And so we're talking on the phone one day. This is before we were ever dating. And I said to her, I'm a little worried that the program's not going to be academically challenging for you. And she said, Del, I don't want it to be academically challenging. I want it to be intellectually stimulating. And I went, wow, what a brilliant thing. Because I'd always been taught gifted kids need academic challenge. You got to provide academic challenge. And yet I'm working in motivation and I'm providing academic challenge and they're not biting. It's because they want intellectual stimulation. That's what all of us want, is intellectual stimulation. And so you have to ask, and academic challenge is part of intellectual stimulation, but intellectual stimulation, it's much more. It's about big ideas. It's about questions that have multiple answers. And so you got to ask yourself, if this kid is not engaging, if this kid doesn't find the work meaningful, is what I'm giving this kid intellectually stimulating? Because that made all the difference in my life, is that it's not about academic challenge, although academic challenge is important, it's about intellectual stimulation. So we need to ensure that we're providing intellectually stimulating environments, and we need to advocate for advanced learning opportunities, and we need to pre-assess. And when we do those, we get these three legs of what I call this stool. Gifted education really has to have three things happening. There has to be access to advanced content. And so we have to be providing compacting. We have to provide options for acceleration. The second thing is it does no good to take this brilliant little person in second grade and move them to fourth grade and bore them to death in fourth grade with advanced content. That content needs to be done intellectually stimulating. It needs to be intellectually stimulating. Classroom teachers have to be having depth and complexity and having intellectually stimulating classrooms. And we know there's an importance of interest. So the third leg is that we have to provide some opportunities during the school week where kids can explore their interests or apply their interests to their assignments. And with that, I went over time, and I'm sorry, but thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Del. I think that will take a while for all of that to be absorbed in my brain. I feel like you've given us some amazing information today, and I love that idea of being intellectually stimulated rather than challenged. I know children who feel like they get this advanced some advanced material, but it's actually, why are you just making me work harder than everyone else?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'll share the slides with you and you can share them with people.
Fantastic. Look, we've got some questions from participants, and again, if you've got more questions, please place them in the Q&A, and we'll get Del to run through a few of those. So the first question is around some of the Carol Dweck fixed mindset, growth mindset, and more to do with teachers. So what do you do when you have and how can we support teachers who might have that fixed mindset idea to help to support teachers to allow that growth mindset or help those children see a way forward to learn? So yeah, how do we adjust the teacher's mindset in order to adjust the child's mindset?
Wow, that's a hard question. I'm always worried
about kids. I guess it comes in line with that role model side of things.
And for the teacher's mindset, I think some bibliotherapy may work. There are so many cases of individuals who weren't stellar students who've done really well in life, you know? Well, we know there's a strong relationship actually between doing well in school and doing well in life. And in the underachievement research, a guy named McCall and all, and this is some early research, found that high school kids with high IQs and mediocre grades tend to do in life what high school kids with mediocre IQs and mediocre grades do, so that their performance in life tends to match their grades rather than, but there are all these exceptions to it. And that's where the growth mindset, I think, comes in, is knowing that Oprah Winfrey had these issues, and Steven Spielberg had these issues, and Nelson Rockefeller was dyslexic, and so I think we can see that where people are now is not where they're going to necessarily end up. And that's because we have so much potential as human beings. Excuse me. The capacity of the brain is amazing. And so we're just selling people short if we believe that they have a fixed intelligence, and if we believe we have a fixed intelligence. And so I think some of those stories might help some. I don't know. I don't know that that's the greatest, but yeah, never sell anybody short. I always say that it's like we all get Lego sets, and some of us have a $100 Lego set, and some of us have the $1.99 Lego set. And so some of us have 10 pieces, and some of us have 2,000 pieces. And we all need to build something out of our Lego sets. And if you've got the 2,000 piece Lego set and you just leave it in the box, I don't care. So what? Don't tell me you've got a 2,000 piece Lego set and you did nothing with it. And you got the 10 piece and you made the coolest thing out of that. That's super great. And so it's what you do with the raw material you have. And that's what growth is all about. It's using the raw material you have to the maximum benefit. Nothing drives me worse than sitting on a plane next to some guy who's 50 years old and wants to tell me his IQ, and then tell me what an underachiever he was in life. And I just want to say, so do something,
Yeah.
It's great to have that high IQ. It gives you all kinds of advantages, but you got to use it, and so.
Yeah. I have a question around the helping children push through challenges. So you were mentioning a little bit around kind of those, I suppose, mistakes being unplanned adventures. What a beautiful line. But in the world of gaming and finding out answers so quickly through technology and not having to do a lot of thinking ourselves, how do we help children move through challenging things when perhaps they're not used to that stickability?
They're used to it constantly in gaming. They fail constantly in that game.
Mm-hmm.
But they get back and do it again
because
something tells them they can be successful, and so we need to use that and can use it as an example, because the first time they played the game, they were terrible at it, they failed miserably, and they keep putting in the old days, they keep putting the quarters in even, now, of course, you pay subscriptions and all that stuff, but gaming is a perfect example of learning from your mistakes. And I think one of the mistakes sometimes, and this is going to sound crazy, kids tend to believe that there's a ceiling on knowledge. This is how much you need to know, and in the game, there are always more levels. They just keep having more levels. You never reach the top, and they build the game that way. And I guess because there's no top, you're willing maybe to fail and keep trying. And maybe in education, because we have this feeling, okay, I've got the 3rd grade math curriculum, and so I'm a failure if I don't reach it. Well, in gaming, you're never a failure because you're never going to reach the top. And so if we could get that mindset somehow changed to kids and say, life is just like a game, and there's no limit to what you can learn. And as you make the mistakes, you learn more, and it just moves you up to new levels. And so I love the gaming analogy.
I like that. So maybe education, we can take that gaming illustration into how we work with things. I like that.
Yeah.
There's a question here around.
You gave me the answer, by the way. I didn't come up with that one. You mentioned gaming.
No, well, I think gaming is such a part of our children's world. And it's quite different to what we do in the classroom a lot of the time.
Yeah.
They don't get that automatic feedback and the fast pace of things.
You get the feedback, so you know what you did wrong.
Yeah.
And the feedback is really important. John Hattie, who is he Australian or New Zealand? You know, he's done meta-analysis. He's known for he's a meta-analysis king, John Hattie. And, you know, his meta-analysis of meta-analyses found that the thing that makes the difference, you know, whether it's class size or whatever, because he's looking at all those things, when he drills down, he came and spoke at UConn a few years ago. He drills down, it has to do with the amount of specific individual feedback a kid gets. And the reason smaller class sizes work is they get better feedback from their teachers. And when you look at the amount of specific feedback a kid gets, like, oh, in this math problem, this is what you're doing wrong. And if you change this, that will fix it. In a given day, kids only get a second or two of that feedback, he found, you know, maybe 5 seconds. And that feedback is the essential element. And that's what the game does. They see what they did wrong so they can go back and do it differently next time.
In time.
In time also. And I know it's too tough for us as teachers because we can't quite give that in time. But if we can give more specific feedback, we can make a big change in kids' attitudes about their mistakes too. Because, you know, if it's 2 weeks later or a week later or even a couple of days later when you get the paper back, it's not important.
We've all forgotten.
We've moved on. We've moved on. Yeah.
Look, I have one more question before I hand over to Michelle. And it's a question around motivation and personality. So just wondering how that works. I suppose in regard to me thinking this question through, your illustration of running and your joy for running, I would need that race, not that I enjoy running, but I would need that race to motivate me. But I do wonder, is there a bit of perfectionism that we maybe put on students? So how does the personality and motivation work, and also us as teachers and our personality?
Yeah, the reward stuff is really interesting, you know, because you need a reward, you know.
Yes, right.
Yeah. And there are a lot of things I need a reward for, you know. And so one of the things we know about motivation and rewards is if somebody's intrinsically motivated to do something, rewards are the worst thing in the world you can do because they could sidetrack off to the reward. And then they're dependent upon the reward, and you always have to be giving it. But if somebody is not intrinsically motivated to do something, an external reward can work. And so I'm going to just tell a quick story. So we had a kid we identified for a gifted program, okay? Kid's parents were teachers. They had an older daughter who we didn't have a gifted program at the time. And when we identified the younger daughter, the parents said, you made a mistake. Our older daughter is brilliant. This one's just an average student. You've made a mistake. I said, the data would indicate we should do something with this kid. Well, okay, but it's our older daughter who's the brilliant one. You made a mistake. So she comes into the gifted program. The parents did not believe in rewards for grades, which I did not know, okay? They wanted it. Okay. I had a thing that I said, you know, anyone who gets all A's, it's when Blizzards came out at Dairy Queens in the US. So that's going to date because Blizzard just celebrated its like 50th anniversary or something. So this is her 40th or whatever. I don't know. So I said, anyone who gets all A's, I will take you and a friend over to Dairy Queen for a Blizzard. Now, that was bad from a perfectionist standpoint. I should have said anyone whose grades improve, because I've said to kids now, you get a B, you're a failure. So totally wrong, okay? But I didn't know that stuff then, okay? So this kid loves Blizzards, okay? Average student. She takes me up on it. And at the end of the first marking period, she has all A's. And I take her and her friend over to Dairy Queen for a Blizzard. And she got all A's all year long, okay? In fact, she graduated valedictorian of her class, you know,
Yeah,
6
yeah.
years later. And the dad said to me, you know, Dal, I'm amazed how well enrichment worked for our daughter. And I wanted to say, no, blizzards worked for your daughter. Now, blizzards got her off the mark.
Yes.
And she got the A's and she liked it.
Yeah.
And then,
it's like that momentum.
Yeah. And then when we took the blizzards away, she kept getting the A's because she could do it. And so, yeah, there are different personalities, and some people need some extra motivation. Other people don't. I mean, some of us are extroverts, some of us are introverts. And so, yeah, personality is a big factor, and the trick is, but from a teaching standpoint, it's really difficult with rewards because one kid needs it and the next one doesn't. You could do damage with one and you could really help another. And so it's a really hard thing for educators, and I feel sorry about it, kind of in some sense. But some kids, it does work, you know.
I love that idea, however, where you're talking about rewarding improvement, because what you're actually doing is providing that intrinsic motivation of just doing better against myself almost.
Yeah. And that's what I should have done instead of just, you have to be perfect. But live and learn.
Del, thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to hand you over to Michelle now. And she'll stay on for just a moment while she says things. You can see all of the thank yous coming through now, which is fantastic. So thank you so much for answering the questions today. I appreciate that.
And thanks for getting up this morning and spending time with me.
That was really wonderful. Please join me in thanking Professor Del Siegle for his wonderful session and generosity in sharing his experience, expertise and insights and increasing motivation. And the intellectual stimulation your presentation gave us today, it was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Del, and we really look forward to your continuing work.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for our fourth webinar in the 2025 Gifted Education Symposium series. Our fifth and final webinar will be on Thursday, the 27th of November, 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, with myself, Dr. Michelle Ronksley-Pavia, and Mrs. Catherine Clark, presenting our research on pressing issues in Australian gifted education, findings from multi-stakeholder perspectives. We look forward to seeing you all then. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.